So Jen and I are here as a duet, but Jen will be glad to hear we're not actually singing. So we're going to be telling you about a project called Parasite Seeing, which we've been doing for the last couple of years. So Parasite Seeing really started with a digital art commission in 2018, commissioned by Neon, northeast of North, in the northeast of in Dundee, actually, in Scotland. In 2018, it started as a Parasite Seeing, which is a digital online version. Everything is from the perspective of Leishmania parasites. Then in 2019, we opened in Lifespace Gallery in Dundee, again, Parasite Seeing Departure Lounge. And so just a little introduction about myself. I started my career as a scientist. I've always worked on insects and microbes. I've been working for a while now on Leishmania and sandflies, right from the field, particularly in Brazil, scaling up to trapping sandflies, looking for Leishmania, working on diagnostics for dogs, for example, right through to the lab where we're working at the molecular level on Leishmania. So this is DS red stained Leishmania inside the gut of a sandfly, right through to the molecular mechanisms of migration of Leishmania inside the sandfly gut. And also, last 15 years or so, I've actually developed work as an artist, working with artists, and as an artist myself, including arts performances and these projects we have going on now. So over to Jen.
Right. So I'm an artist. I'm also the creative director for the Centre for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University. And a lot of my previous arts practice has been to do with tracking the way that people, animals and technologies are mobile together. And so there's just a couple of examples here to do with tracking players in a mass football game, which was then embossed into this football, tracking dogs and how dogs walk with each other and their owner. And I've worked with mountain rescue teams and tracking dogs there. So I often visualize the movement of people and animals. And so when Rod and I started working together, we were really interested in thinking about Leishmania in terms of its mobility on a lot of different scales. And we started the project by we were commissioned by WCare and Neon up in Dundee. And we started by talking to the scientists there up in Dundee and at Lancaster and a lot of the students who were working with Leishmania about the mobilities within their research. So whether it was the mobility of the Leishmania parasite itself and it's in its life cycle, or the mobilities of the Leishmania through a research laboratory, historical mobilities. So we took all these stories and tried to work out how we could tell a story or tell all those multiple stories in a way that would be accessible. And we wanted to tell all the stories, not just the story of the science, but also the histories of Leishmania, the spread of Leishmania over millennia, and how it affects people in their daily lives now. So we decided to do that, influenced a bit by Anna Singh, the anthropologist Anna Singh, this idea that a rush of stories can be a method of dealing with this problem of scale from the microscopic to the global. And so, actually I've covered a lot of this, haven't I? But we wanted to tell those multiple stories and to tell them in an accessible way. So we decided to write 8 stories from the perspective of the Leishmania parasite and tell them through different media streams. So we were using Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and a blog, and give them really different characters so they would tell very different stories. So very briefly, and this is the website, so we called it Parasite Seeing, and had a logo made, and then we told these 8 stories. So the first, and I'm going to quickly go over those and then hand over to Rod, who's going to tell you a bit more. So the 8 stories, there's Electra Dominica, which is about the history of the sandfly trapped in amber and the the Leishmania parasite that's been seen in that amber. There's LD Bob, which tells the story of the naming of one of the strains of Leishmania LD Bob. There's Sand Flyer, which is based in Rod's lab and the travel of the parasite through that lab. There's Freezer Cat 3, which is the story of the research in the Dundee labs. Unleashed is it looks at the kind of historical journeys of Leishmania, and it's told in the style of a Victorian journalist, because in Dundee there were two women travellers who were published a lot by the local newspaper in looking at social conditions around the world, and so we did a kind of parody of their writing style. Leishmania.we tells a story of sort of Leishmania in the wild, and this was told through an Instagram account, so we wrote the narrative, but then we worked with Yasmin Kamodzi, who's here in the audience, and to translate that into a language that would fit on Instagram. Visceral Media tells links to a lot of stories online, a lot of social media about Leishmania. And finally, Ghost Hoard, it's a kind of bit of an interloper. It's actually took from the perspective of the drugs and how they're delivered within the human body. And it's like a kind of assassin story, like an airport novel in a way. And so these are just a couple of examples from Leishmania.we. At last, a holiday, we escaped to the Great Spleen, a real hub for activity, but it was very busy, and lots of hashtags with it. And an example from Sandflyer, all these images are from Rod's lab. And again, lots of hashtags that relate to things like safety checklist and flight ready, which might be more relatable in terms of normal travel, but also optimal cell division and things that relate more to the science. So there's a kind of real mix of ways that we're addressing an audience. And for the Neon Festival, we had a selfie booth where people could pose with this model of the Leishmania parasite. And we were, all the way through the project, we were really aware that we were taking something that's literally deadly serious, and we were making it accessible through the use of humour. And we then started to, all the way through, we were really trying to make sure that we weren't trivialising the disease while making it kind of accessible to a broader audience. And that's where I'm going to pass over to Rod.
Okay, so I think that as the scientist in me sort of actually gained quite a few new perspectives about this project, actually, because I actually started to think from the perspective of Leishmania, which is quite an unusual sort of angle. So when I set up the Twitter account, LD Bob, so LD Bob is named after Bob Olofsson, a famous Leishmaniac. So a parasitologist working on Leishmania. So LD Bob was searching for their ancestors, but I had to think about the voice of LD Bob before I started. So Leishmania are clones, okay? So there's no he or she, so I had to think about the gender and how to address LD Bob. So it's actually a we and they. It's not even though Bob is Bob, Bob is a we and they. So immediately there was a sort of, wow, that's interesting. Never thought about that before. So tweeting as LD Bob was a sort of quite a learning experience. And you can follow LD Bob, and LD Bob will respond. So the next phase of the project really was where Life Space Gallery in Dundee invited us to set up this physical installation. And so we had sort of all sorts of thoughts about what we would do, how we were going to do this, because it's quite a large space to fill in a proper contemporary art gallery, the only science art gallery in Scotland, actually. And so we wanted to sort of take the familiar, an airport lounge, to address the unfamiliar, a neglected tropical disease. So this was the development of our Parasite Seeing Departure Lounge installation. So this is a full-sized installation in the Life Space Gallery in Dundee. So you could actually come up to this, the check-in desk. So we've got actually, don't know if you know any of you, Alan Fairlamb checking in here, transforming himself into a Leishmania parasite, getting the passport, putting in the LD Bob sticker, and checking out the departures board. So lots of little science in here for the science nerds. So you could take your flight to the dog in Belo Horizonte, or you could go for a rabbit in Madrid, and the different flights and the flight gates, and there was actually announcements actually developed by a friend of mine from Rio. She was giving the announcements in Portuguese and English. As you walk past, you can sort of say something to LD Bob. What do you want to say? What would you like to say to a Leishmania parasite? So lots of interesting answers there. And then you can go in and sit down in the departures lounge with your obligatory Bloody Mary cocktail, and you can check out some of the sort of digital online stuff that Jen was talking about. And we have a free newspaper that Jen was very much developed along the lines of the Edwardian ladies in Dundee. So it's quite a sort of focused audience we have here. There's Alan again popping up, checking out the Unleashed paper. And then when you're ready to board, we have the gates lined with the Sansevieria, which are mimicking the sandfly mouth parts. And we have in front of you Leishmania longipalpis, the Brazilian sandfly that transmits Leishmania infantum. So then you go through into the sandfly gut itself. It's like a sort of little boudoir for Leishmania parasites. And you can sit down, take your selfie, and have fun attaching and reattaching Leishmania along the sandfly gut. So attachment inside the gut is crucial to transmission of the parasites, and that's one of the things I'm actually working on in the lab. And finally, as you go out, you can address this poem that Stuart, Jen's partner, produced alongside with some of the scientists in the Dundee labs about the transmission of the drugs and anti-leishmanial drugs in the body. It's a sort of airport thriller, I think it is supposed to be. So I think travelling with Leishmania is, so I think this is a very specific audience we developed it for, and I think we've got some huge responses. And in fact, I think that that show actually sort of outsold, as it were, lots of previous shows in the gallery. We are modest, but it was very successful, and it was very interactive. So you go around with your passport, you stamp your passport, you sort of move the parasites around. So everyone from 8 to 80 could take something away from it, from scientists to kids, basically, or artists, contemporary artists. So I think thinking about things from the perspective of the Leishmania parasite is quite a sort of powerful way of doing things. I mean, we are human beings. We've got human anthropocentric views, but of course the planet is shared by many other species, and Leishmania is actually one of them. So we always think about eradication of these species, but this is a very human-centered viewpoint. It's got some sort of basis, but if you put the artist's hat on, you could actually, you do think quite differently. So you can actually think about not only human rights, but are there Leishmania rights? Are we right to eradicate a species, even a species that kills human beings? Something to throw out, something to think about. So this Parasite Seeing installation is just in its initial journey, really. We are taking this Parasite Seeing on a world tour, of course. And so it's starting in Brazil. We're going to be moving to Brazil, and of course it's going to be a Brazilian version with Brazilian scientists, Brazilian artists being involved, and local people. It's going to be a very new, exciting installation in Oswaldo Cruz in Rio. And then after that, we're hoping to use the Oswaldo Cruz science bus to do a flat pack Brazilian version parasite tour on the buses around Brazil, and then I don't know where after that. So we just finish off by thanking lots of people, particularly the curators, Donna, Holly, and Sarah, who were involved in setting up the installations in Dundee. Ali Floyd, Public Engagement Officer employed by Wellcome in Dundee, along with a load of scientists involved, Lancaster, Leonie, Stuart, Sophie, of course Yasmin, who's here with us, and of course the Wellcome Trust really funded this, and we're so grateful for their support. Okay, thank you.